The cowboy had been riding since early morning, his horse moving steadily across the open prairie. The sun had already dipped low, painting the horizon with shades of red and gold. The land stretched wide, with tall grass swaying in the evening breeze and the distant call of coyotes echoing across the hills. He was used to long rides in silence, but that evening something unusual reached his ears. It was faint, almost lost in the rustle of the wind, like the sound of someone crying. He slowed his horse and tilted his head, listening carefully. The sound came again, thin and weak, drifting through the air. It wasn't the call of an animal. It was human. The cowboy's brow tightened and he nudged his horse toward the direction of the sound. His instincts had been trained by years on the frontier. Cries in the wilderness usually meant trouble, and in those lands trouble was never far away. As he moved deeper into the thicket of mesquite trees, he kept his hand close to his revolver. The land was harsh and ambushes were not uncommon. Yet the sound grew clearer, now a whimper, now a desperate sob. His horse stepped carefully over uneven ground until at last the cowboy broke into a small clearing. There his eyes fell on a sight that made him pull back the reins in shock. A young Comanche girl stood tied to a tree, her wrists bound with rough rope, her dark hair tangled and falling across her face. Her dress was torn from struggle, her cheeks streaked with tears. She looked no older than 15 or 16. Her chest rose and fell quickly as though fear had stolen her breath. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had seen cruel acts before, but leaving a girl bound in the open wilderness was something that turned his stomach. He dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her. The girl raised her head and met his eyes. For a moment she looked uncertain, her body trembling. But there was also a spark of hope there. She did not speak at first. She simply stared at him with wide, pleading eyes. The cowboy stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on dry leaves. "Easy now," he said in a calm, steady voice. "I ain't here to hurt you." She tilted her head, straining against the ropes. Her lips moved, but the words that escaped her mouth were a mixture of English and her native tongue. He caught fragments. Help, free, beasts. The cowboy understood enough. He looked around the clearing. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and dust, but beneath it was something else, wild musk. He knew that smell well. Wolves. The thought struck him hard. Whoever had tied her there had done so with cruel purpose, leaving her as bait for the wild beasts that prowled after sundown. The cowboy felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. The wolves would come soon. He needed to act fast, but he also knew sudden movement could bring them closer before he was ready. He crouched near the girl, studying the knots. They were tight, biting into her skin. It would take time to untie them, and time was something they did not have. Her eyes shifted toward the tall grass, and the cowboy followed her gaze. In the dim light he saw movement, shadows slipping through the grass, low and silent. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle slung across his back. He whispered softly, "Hold on. You're gonna be all right." The girl gave a small nod, her lips pressed together to keep from crying out. She seemed to understand that noise could draw the creatures nearer. The cowboy rose slowly, every sense sharpened. He counted at least 3 shadows moving, circling just beyond the edge of the clearing. Their glowing eyes caught the last rays of twilight. He adjusted his stance, his boots firm on the ground, rifle steady in his hands. The girl's breath came quick and shallow, the ropes biting deeper into her wrists as she tried not to panic. The cowboy glanced back at her once more. Her gaze was fixed on him, clinging to the last hope that he might be her savior. The prairie had grown quiet now. The usual chirp of crickets had gone still, as though the creatures of the night knew what was coming. The cowboy knew it too. His heart beat steady, not with fear but with the readiness of a man who had faced danger too many times to count. He whispered again, mostly to himself this time. "Not tonight. Not while I'm standing here." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint growl of wolves. The cowboy held his ground. The beasts were testing the air, deciding when to strike. His finger rested lightly against the trigger. He didn't want to waste bullets too early. Each shot had to count. He took a slow step forward, placing himself between the girl and the tall grass. The wolf's eyes flashed again, and one low shape crept closer. The cowboy raised his rifle, sighting carefully. The girl tensed against the tree, her eyes shutting tight as though bracing for what might come. A sudden snarl ripped through the air and the first wolf leapt from the shadows. The cowboy's rifle cracked, the sound echoing across the prairie like thunder. The beast fell before it reached them, and the pack retreated for a moment, startled by the noise and fire. Smoke curled from the barrel of the rifle as the cowboy steadied himself again. He didn't lower the weapon. He knew they would come again, and perhaps in greater numbers. The girl's eyes opened wide with shock, and for the first time, relief flickered across her face. A single bullet had turned certain death into a fighting chance. The cowboy exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle just enough to glance back at her. "I told you," he said softly, his voice steady. "You're gonna be all right." But in his heart he knew the night was only beginning. The prairie was still, but danger lingered just beyond the tall grass. The wolves had tasted fear, and they were not done yet. He would need all his skill, all his courage to keep the girl alive until the dawn. The cowboy shifted his stance, readying himself for the fight to come. The girl, though still bound, no longer looked defeated. She watched him with something close to trust. In that silent clearing, with shadow circling and the prairie holding its breath, two lives had become tied together by fate, and by a single bullet that had changed everything. The night grew darker, and the last color faded from the sky. The prairie was now covered in shadows, with only the moon rising slowly to cast a silver light across the grass. The cowboy stood firm, his rifle in hand, his boots planted between the tied Comanche girl and the danger that crept closer. His horse snorted nervously nearby, stamping the ground, sensing what was hidden in the tall grass. The girl pressed her back against the tree, her breathing sharp and quick. Her hands struggled against the ropes, but they were tied too tight. She looked at the cowboy again, her lips trembling, though no sound came out. Fear kept her silent. She knew her life depended on the man with the rifle. The cowboy shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the grass line. He could see the glowing eyes moving again. 3, no, 4 of them now. Wolves were clever, and they didn't attack without testing their prey. The first had fallen, but the others had learned from it. They circled carefully, their bodies low, their paws silent on the earth. The cowboy's finger rested lightly against the trigger. He had only so many bullets, and he knew wasting them would be a mistake. He needed to wait for the right moment. The land grew still again, and only the sound of the girl's shallow breaths filled the air. Then came the growl, deep, throaty, carried by the wind. The girl flinched at the sound, and the cowboy tightened his grip. He lifted the rifle slowly, his eyes narrowing. A shape appeared from the grass, larger than the first. Its teeth glistened in the moonlight as it crouched low, ready to spring. The cowboy aimed. Another crack split the night. The shot echoed across the clearing, and the wolf dropped, tumbling into the dirt. The girl gasped sharply, her eyes wide, but this time there was a flicker of hope. The cowboy did not lower his rifle. He knew the others were still out there. Silence followed for a long moment. The prairie wind rustled the grass, but the wolves did not move. They were waiting, studying him. The cowboy glanced back at the girl, who whispered something in her own language. Though he could not understand the words, her tone was clear. She was pleading, not for herself anymore, but for him. The cowboy's heart tightened, but his face remained calm. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I ain't leaving you." The grass shifted again, and this time 2 wolves moved at once, circling from different sides. The cowboy steadied his rifle, but he knew he couldn't fire in 2 directions at once. His jaw clenched. His horse reared, neighing loudly, the sound startling the pack for just a moment. The cowboy took the chance. He aimed at the nearest wolf and fired. The shot rang true, the beast collapsing mid-step. The other lunged forward, teeth bared, and the cowboy swung his rifle around. But the wolf was too close. In an instant, the cowboy dropped the rifle and pulled the revolver from his belt. He fired once, the flash lighting the darkness, and the wolf fell just feet away from him. Smoke curled from the revolver as he exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The girl had shut her eyes, but when she opened them again, she saw the wolf lying still on the ground. Her eyes filled with tears, not only of fear, but of relief. The cowboy bent down, retrieving his rifle. He counted the bodies in the clearing, 3 wolves now, silent in the dirt. But he knew the danger was not over. Packs could run deep, and others might be waiting. His ears strained, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a long, haunting howl rose into the night. The girl stiffened against the tree, whispering again, her voice shaking. The cowboy turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers. She was terrified, but not of him, of what was still out there. "We ain't done," he muttered under his breath. He moved back to stand in front of her again, every sense alive, his revolver still in hand. Minutes passed slowly. The night air was cool, carrying the sharp scent of dust, grass, and smoke. The cowboy's horse stamped nervously again, pulling at the reins tied to a low branch. The girl shifted, wincing as the ropes dug deeper into her wrists. She whispered again, but this time her words were softer, calmer, almost as though she were praying. The cowboy kept his eyes on the grass, but her quiet voice reached him. He didn't understand her language, but he understood the tone. She was trying to steady herself. In that moment, he felt a deep respect for her. She was frightened, but she was brave enough not to scream or thrash wildly. She knew silence might save her life. Then from the far side of the clearing came movement again. A larger shadow slipped forward, slower, more cautious than the others. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. This one was bigger, perhaps the leader of the pack. Its eyes burned in the moonlight as it stepped closer, teeth bared. The cowboy raised his revolver, steady as stone. He waited. The wolf prowled forward, its growl vibrating low in its throat. The girl pressed her forehead against the tree, tears sliding down her cheeks as she whispered rapidly, her words quick as her heartbeat. The wolf crouched, ready to leap. The cowboy exhaled once, then fired. The shot rang out sharp and clear. The beast jerked, staggered, then dropped heavily into the dirt. The prairie went quiet. For a long moment, nothing moved. The cowboy scanned the shadows, waiting for the others to test him again. But the grass remained still, the glowing eyes fading into the distance. The howls grew faint further and further away until silence returned fully. The cowboy lowered his revolver, his shoulders easing just slightly. He turned to the girl, who stared at him in awe. She was still trembling, but her tears now carried a different meaning. She had been left to die, but this stranger had stood against the wild and kept her alive. He stepped toward her, sliding the revolver back into its holster. She flinched at first, but then steadied, realizing he meant no harm. He crouched beside her, studying the ropes again. They were tied cruelly tight, cutting into her skin. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Hold still," he said gently. The girl nodded faintly. Her dark eyes watched him closely as he worked the blade under the rope. With a quick slice, the bonds loosened and she gasped as her arms dropped free. She rubbed her wrists red and raw, but she did not complain. The cowboy put the knife away and stood, offering her his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her small, trembling hand in his. He pulled her gently to her feet. She swayed slightly, her legs weak from being tied for so long. He reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, offering it to her. She took it carefully, sipping the water, her eyes never leaving his face. She whispered something again, softly, her tone filled with gratitude. The cowboy gave a small nod. He couldn't understand her words, but he understood her heart. As the moon rose higher, the prairie seemed calmer, yet he knew they couldn't stay there. Wolves might return, or worse, men might come searching. Whoever had tied her there might not be far away. He looked at her, his voice steady. "We've got to move." She nodded slowly, still clutching the canteen. For the first time that night, her fear seemed to ease just a little. She trusted him now. The cowboy whistled low, and his horse trotted forward, ears still twitching nervously. He guided the girl gently toward the animal, preparing to lift her into the saddle. The prairie night was far from safe, but the first step had been taken. He had saved her life once already. Now he would have to protect it until the end of the trail. The cowboy steadied the Comanche girl as she sat carefully on the saddle. Her small hands gripped the horn tightly, though her body was still weak from fear and exhaustion. The cowboy adjusted the reins, patting his horse's neck softly. The animal was uneasy, its ears twitching at every distant sound, but it obeyed its master's calm touch. The clearing where she had been tied no longer felt safe. Wolves had been driven off, but the cowboy knew the wilderness held many dangers. More wolves could return, or worse, the very men who had left her there might come back to finish what they had started. He needed to get her far away before that happened. He swung into the saddle behind her, his strong hands holding the reins steady. The girl leaned forward slightly, her shoulders tense, but she did not resist his presence. She knew her life now rested in his hands. With a gentle tug, the cowboy guided the horse forward, leaving the clearing behind them. The moonlight painted a pale path across the prairie, showing them the way. The night was quiet but not peaceful. Every rustle in the grass, every snap of a twig kept the cowboy alert. He kept one hand near his revolver, ready for anything. The girl sat stiffly, glancing around with wide eyes. From time to time she whispered in her language, her voice soft like a prayer. Though he couldn't understand, the cowboy knew she was speaking from her heart. They rode for a while in silence. The horse's steady steps carried them across rolling land, through patches of trees and over dry creeks. The cowboy's mind worked quickly. Who had tied the girl there, and why? He knew the Comanche people followed strong traditions. For one of their own to be abandoned in such a cruel way meant there was more to the story. At last, the girl turned her head slightly, glancing back at him. Her lips parted and she tried to speak in broken English. "You... save!" she whispered, her voice trembling. She placed her hand lightly on her chest, then gestured toward him. "Bullet. Life." The cowboy gave a small nod, his eyes steady on the trail ahead. "You're safe now," he replied softly. "Ain't no beast gonna get you while I'm here." She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, her dark eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow. She turned back toward the land, stretching before them, silent again. The prairie wind grew colder as the night deepened. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, glancing at the girl. She shivered slightly in the chill, so he reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a wool blanket. Without a word, he draped it gently around her shoulders. She clutched it close, her lips pressing together, her eyes glistening with unspoken thanks. Hours passed as they rode beneath the silver moon. The cowboy's sharp eyes caught movement now and then, rabbits darting through the grass, an owl swooping low, but no wolves followed them. Still, he did not relax. He knew better than to trust the quiet. Danger in the west often came when least expected. Finally, when the horse began to slow from weariness, the cowboy guided them toward a sheltered grove of cottonwood trees. A small stream ran nearby, its soft gurgle breaking the silence of the night. He dismounted first, then helped the girl down gently. She staggered slightly, her legs weak, but he steadied her with a firm hand. "Rest a while," he said quietly. He led the horse to the stream, letting it drink, then tied the reins loosely to a branch. The girl crouched near the water, cupping her hands to drink. The cool stream washed the dust from her face, and for the first time since he had found her, some color returned to her cheeks. The cowboy knelt nearby, refilling his canteen. As he did, he studied her more closely. She was young, perhaps 16, with striking features that carried both strength and innocence. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, her eyes shadowed with fear, yet there was a quiet resilience about her. She had endured what might have broken another. After drinking, she sat by the stream, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her gaze wandered to the cowboy and she spoke again, carefully forming the words. "Men, bad, leave me." She paused, searching for the right way to explain. "Enemy? Want beast? Take me." The cowboy's eyes narrowed slightly. He understood enough. Whoever had tied her there wanted her dead, but not by their hands, by the jaws of wild animals. His jaw clenched. It was a cruel fate, worse than a quick death. "Why?" he asked softly, though he didn't expect her to answer fully. The girl lowered her eyes, silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head, her voice low. "Shame. Law. I not know." She pressed her hand to her chest again. "But you come." Her eyes lifted, meeting his with quiet wonder. "You shoot. Save." The cowboy looked away, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. He didn't like hearing the pain in her voice. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for thanks. But deep inside he felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. Fate had led him to that clearing, and perhaps there was a reason. He broke a few dry branches and built a small fire, shielding it with stones so its glow wouldn't spread too far. The flames flickered softly, warming the cool night air. The girl sat close, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She seemed calmer now, the fear slowly leaving her face. They shared a small meal from his saddlebag, dried meat and hard bread. She ate quietly, carefully, as though each bite was precious. When she finished, she whispered something again, her words soft and respectful. The cowboy gave a slight nod, not needing to understand the language. As the fire crackled, the girl lay down near it, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself. Her eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, yet she stayed awake for a while, glancing at the cowboy. He sat nearby, rifle across his knees, his eyes never leaving the shadows beyond the firelight. Finally, the girl whispered one last word before sleep claimed her. "Safe." The cowboy turned his head slightly, watching her as she drifted into slumber. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips. She trusted him. Out here, trust was not given easily. It was earned. The hours passed slowly. The fire burned low and the cowboy remained awake, listening to every sound of the night, the rustle of grass, the distant cry of an owl, the gurgle of the stream. He was used to nights without sleep. Danger did not rest, and neither could he. At dawn, the horizon began to glow faintly with soft pink light. The cowboy stirred the fire back to life and stood, stretching his tired muscles. His horse lifted its head, ears pricking at the sound of morning birds. The girl woke slowly, rubbing her eyes. She sat up, clutching the blanket, and looked around with confusion as though for a moment she couldn't believe she was still alive. When her gaze found the cowboy, relief washed across her face. She smiled faintly, a fragile but genuine smile. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly, his voice calm. "We'll ride at first light." "Gotta get you home." She blinked, her lips parting. "Home?" she repeated softly. He nodded. "Your people." Her eyes lowered, shadowed by uncertainty. But she gave a small nod, whispering, "Yes." The cowboy packed his things, saddled the horse, and helped her mount once again. As they rode out of the grove, the prairie opened before them, painted in morning colors. The girl held the blanket tight, glancing back once at the grove, then turning her eyes forward. The cowboy guided the horse toward the distant hills. He didn't know what awaited them there, acceptance, anger, or more danger. But he knew one thing. He would see her safely back to her people no matter the cost. And though he didn't yet realize it, this journey was only the beginning. The sun had risen higher, spreading golden light across the wide prairie. The cowboy guided his horse steadily, the Comanche girl sitting quietly in the saddle before him, wrapped in the wool blanket he had given her. The night's terror still lingered in her eyes, but the warmth of the day seemed to give her a little strength. She no longer trembled as she had before, though her silence told the cowboy she was still weighed down by fear and worry. The trail stretched endlessly before them. Rolling hills rose in the distance, dotted with clusters of trees, while the air carried the sweet smell of sagebrush. The cowboy kept scanning the horizon, his eyes sharp. He wasn't only watching for wolves. Men could be a greater danger than beasts. Whoever had tied the girl to that tree might be searching even now, and if they caught the cowboy with her, it would mean bloodshed. The girl shifted slightly in the saddle, turning her head as though she wanted to speak. Her lips parted, but at first only silence came. Finally, in soft, broken English, she said, "You take me home?" The cowboy gave a slight nod, his voice calm. "That's where we're headed." She hesitated, her eyes lowering. "My people maybe not want me." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, struggling with words. "Shame, they say. Law broken. They tie me." Her voice cracked and she looked away, ashamed. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had guessed as much. Some tribes carried strict codes, and if they believed she had dishonored them in some way, punishment could be cruel. But leaving her for beasts was no justice. He kept his voice steady, wanting to reassure her. "Law or no law, you don't deserve what they did," he said. "And if they can't see that, then I'll stand for you." The girl turned to look at him, her eyes wide, searching his face. She said nothing, but the way she stared told him she believed his words. Slowly she nodded, and though her lips trembled, there was relief in her eyes. The day grew hotter as they rode on. The cowboy gave her his canteen again, and she drank gratefully. Hours passed, and finally they came upon a ridge. From the top, the land stretched wide, and in the far distance, faint smoke rose into the sky. The girl's eyes widened. She lifted her hand, pointing. "My people," she whispered. The cowboy narrowed his eyes, studying the smoke. It marked the presence of a camp, and from the look of it, it was no small one. He knew walking into a Comanche village could be dangerous for a white man. But he also knew he couldn't leave her wandering alone. "All right," he said softly. "We'll ride there. But when we get close, you'll have to speak for me. Let them know I ain't their enemy." The girl nodded slowly, though her body tensed with worry. She knew her people could be quick to anger if they misunderstood. By late afternoon, they reached the outer edges of the Comanche territory. The land changed here, more signs of human presence. Spears leaned against trees. Tracks marked the dirt, and the air carried the faint sound of drums. The girl's back stiffened, her eyes darting nervously. Suddenly, from behind a cluster of trees, riders appeared. 4 Comanche warriors burst onto the trail, bows drawn, their ponies quick and agile. The cowboy pulled his horse to a stop, raising one hand calmly while keeping the other near his holster just in case. The girl gasped, clutching the blanket tighter. She cried out in her language, speaking rapidly. The warriors' horses circled, their eyes fierce, arrows aimed straight at the cowboy. The cowboy sat tall, his face calm. He didn't move, knowing sudden action would mean death. He let the girl's voice carry, trusting her to explain. One warrior, older and with eagle feathers tied to his hair, rode closer. His sharp eyes studied the cowboy, then moved to the girl. He barked a question in their tongue. The girl answered quickly, her voice trembling but strong. She pointed at the cowboy, then lifted her hands as though firing an invisible rifle. She spoke again, her words urgent. The older warrior's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking back to the cowboy. For a long moment the air was heavy with tension. Then slowly the warrior lowered his bow. He said something sharp to the others, and they followed his lead, lowering their weapons. The girl sagged with relief. She turned to the cowboy, whispering, "They listen. I tell them. You save me." The cowboy gave a single nod, though his hand stayed close to his side. Trust could turn to danger quickly, and he knew he had to remain cautious. The warriors gestured for them to follow. The cowboy guided his horse forward, riding behind the riders with the girl still in front of him. They entered the Comanche camp as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Dozens of eyes turned toward them as they arrived. Children ran to their mothers. Elders stood from their fires, and warriors gathered with sharp gazes. The girl's people had thought her lost. Her return caused an outcry of voices, some of joy, some of suspicion. The cowboy dismounted slowly, lifting the girl gently from the horse. She stood on her own now, clutching the blanket, her face pale but determined. She began speaking quickly, her words flowing in her native tongue. All eyes followed her as she pointed to the cowboy again and again. The camp grew quiet as her story spread. The elders listened, their faces stern. Some nodded, some frowned. The girl's voice rose with emotion, her hands moving as she described the wolves, the bullet, the fire. She ended with a gesture to her chest, then to the cowboy. Silence followed. Finally, one elder spoke, his voice deep and commanding. He stepped forward, his piercing eyes fixed on the cowboy. Though the cowboy could not understand the words, the tone was sharp, questioning. The girl answered quickly, her voice shaking but firm. She raised her chin, standing tall despite her fear. The cowboy could see it in her eyes. This was the moment. She was not only telling them about her rescue, she was defending him, putting her own name alongside his. At last, the elder nodded slowly. He raised his hand, and the tension in the camp eased. The people murmured among themselves, and though not all faces looked friendly, the threat of violence passed. The girl turned to the cowboy, her face breaking into a tired but grateful smile. "They believe," she whispered. "They know you save." The cowboy gave a faint smile in return, tipping his hat. He didn't need thanks spoken in words. The fact that she stood safe among her people was enough, but in his heart he also knew this wasn't the end. Trust had been given, but just barely, and in the days to come, he would see whether the bond formed in a single night of fire and fear could withstand the weight of tradition and law. The evening firelight flickered through the Comanche camp, casting long shadows across the ground. The cowboy stood quietly near his horse, his hands resting on the saddle while dozens of curious eyes remained fixed on him. He was an outsider in every way, his clothes, his pale skin, the revolver at his side. Yet he had walked into the very heart of their village, not as an enemy, but as the man who had saved one of their daughters from certain death. The Comanche girl sat near her people now, wrapped still in his wool blanket. Her mother pressed her close, tears running down her cheeks as she whispered prayers of thanks. The girl's father, a stern warrior with braided hair and a scar across his cheek, stood tall among the elders, his face unreadable. He had not yet spoken a word since her return. The cowboy remained still, giving them their moment. He understood family ties, and he knew his place was not at the center of their reunion. Yet every now and then the girl's eyes found his in the firelight. They were eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, respect, trust, and perhaps a bond that neither of them had expected. After a long while, the elders gathered near the fire. The camp quieted as they spoke among themselves in low voices. The cowboy could not understand the words, but he knew their meaning. They were deciding his fate. In these lands, one man could be called either friend or enemy in a single breath. The girl suddenly rose, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. She spoke to the elders, her words strong and filled with emotion. She gestured toward the cowboy again and again, describing the night, the wolves, the bullet that had struck at just the right moment. She spoke of the fire he built, the water he gave, and the way he had shielded her with his body when danger circled close. Her voice carried across the camp, silencing the whispers of doubt. Children sat wide-eyed. Warriors folded their arms and mothers nodded slowly as the story spread. By the time she finished, her cheeks were wet with tears, but her chin was lifted high. She stood not only as the girl who had been tied to a tree, but as the girl who had survived because of the man now standing in their midst. The head elder, a man with white braids and weathered skin, stepped forward. His deep eyes studied the cowboy as if trying to see into his soul. Then he spoke in slow, deliberate English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. You save not Comanche, not kin, yet you fight wolves. You keep her life, why? The cowboy met his gaze without hesitation. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of truth. Because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be left for beasts, not her, not anyone. The elder watched him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. He turned to the others, speaking again in his language. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but this time they carried less suspicion and more respect. The girl's father finally stepped forward. His eyes were sharp but no longer cold. He placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, then turned toward the cowboy. With a single solemn gesture, he touched his chest and bowed his head slightly. It was not friendship yet, but it was honor. The cowboy tipped his hat in return. Words were not needed. That night, the camp allowed him to stay within its circle. He sat near his horse, the fire warming his face while the people ate and sang softly. The girl, now surrounded by her family, glanced his way often. Each time their eyes met, there was a quiet understanding that would never be forgotten. By morning, the cowboy knew it was time to leave. He was not Comanche, and though they had accepted his actions, he did not belong among them. He saddled his horse at first light, moving with quiet care. The camp was beginning to stir, smoke rising again into the cool dawn sky. The girl approached him, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were brighter now, filled not with fear but with strength. She stood before him silent for a moment, then spoke softly. You, go, he gave a small nod. It's best. Your people need you. I've done my part. She lowered her eyes, gripping the blanket tighter. Then she looked up again, her voice trembling but firm. I live because of you. The cowboy gave a faint smile. That's all that matters. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of bread, placing it gently in her hands. Keep this. A reminder, not of me, but of the night you proved stronger than fear. Her fingers closed around it, her lips pressing together as if holding back words. Finally, she whispered, Safe ride. He tipped his hat, his voice low but warm, and safe life. As he mounted his horse, the girl stepped back. Her people watched silently, but none moved to stop him. The cowboy turned his horse toward the open prairie. The morning sun casting golden light across the land. The hoofbeats carried him away from the camp, each step taking him further into the endless horizon. Behind him, the girl stood tall among her people. She was no longer the helpless figure tied to a tree. She was the survivor of the wilderness, the one who had looked into the eyes of death and found salvation in the crack of a cowboy's bullet. The legend of that night would not fade. Around Comanche fires, stories would be told of the stranger who had ridden out of nowhere, fought off the wolves, and returned their daughter when hope was gone. And for the cowboy, though he never sought glory, the memory of her eyes in the firelight would ride with him always. He rode on, his hat pulled low against the rising sun, the prairie wide and endless before him. He did not know where the trail would lead next, but he carried with him the quiet knowledge that for one night, he had been exactly where he was meant to be, and though he would never speak it aloud, deep in his heart, he knew that somewhere in that Comanche village, a young girl would never forget the cowboy whose bullet had saved her life.